The story followed a small 5-year-old girl who was reading a book intently as she sat on the floor of the study. She couldn't believe her eyes, even when she read it multiple times. She stared at the content so hard that her head started feeling heavy. At first, she thought it was just a novel, but it wasn't that uncomplicated. It was about her. Previously, the scene was set at a ball where the nobles were discussing the Duke, as it was said he would be coming. Duke Damien Frodium was nicknamed the Monster Duke since he didn't show his face frequently. People were eager to see him at least once. Everyone started pointing at the Duke, who was talking to someone. A woman who had recently debuted into high society asked why he was called a Monster Duke, as he didn't look like one. Another woman answered that the Duke of Frodium came from the most prestigious family in the empire. He was a master swordsman and possessed good looks. She confessed that they called him Monster not because they were scared of him, but out of admiration for him. They were just honoring the most formidable person in the empire, and any human being would seem inferior compared to him. Such a perfect person couldn't exist. All the stories about him were accurate. Duke Frodium was a demon who enjoyed spilling blood and slaughtering others. He made the whole continent tremble in fear. But from some point on, the evil influence from him completely disappeared. The Monster Duke's only daughter was human. A few months ago, Lotto Lucia arrived at the Frodium estate. People exclaimed that the child had fallen from the sky. She was also called Lottie. When Lotto Lucia first saw Damien, she immediately recognized him as her father. It was like a fairy tale come true for her. Damien confirmed her doubts. He looked at her coldly and ordered the butler Bellant to raise her in the mansion so she wouldn't die. His indifference towards meeting his daughter for the first time angered her. She was grateful he took her in, but upset at his lack of effort. Most people seemed to follow her father's orders obediently, so she was sure they would raise her only to the extent that she wouldn't die. Even her room was far from her father's, as she expected. It was a hint to her that he wanted Lottie to stay out of his sight and out of trouble. Lottie complained that she didn't stand out to anyone who disliked her. Suddenly, she heard whispers from outside the door. 3 maids entered Lottie's room and were amazed by how cute she was. They offered her a cookie and Lottie accepted it with a bright smile. She said it was yummy and they offered her more, indicating their preference for having her in the mansion. However, the opinions of those who were in the mansion were divided. Some told Lottie that she was pitiful since her mother didn't come to find her and that the Duke would ensure she got adopted into a good family. She was confused and asked them why she would get adopted when the Duke was her father. She was pitied, called cute, and taken care of by the people in the mansion. The maids were then scolded by another maid. She told them to get back to work and not distract the other maids, lest they anger the butler. The maid said goodbye to Lottie and left, leaving her alone in her room. Her face turned glum as she thought about how someone wasn't happy that she existed. Lottie thought that the maids were taken away so they couldn't get close to her. The next day, Lottie sat on her bed, her stomach growling as she pondered why her food still hadn't come. The mealtime had already passed, and she was used to having her meals brought to her room instead of eating with her father. She found the arrangements suitable, but not when the meals arrived late. She started to wonder which maid was in charge that day and remembered the encounter she had with the rude maid the day before. It was her. She was furious at the maid for not doing her job well and vowed to trouble her the next time she was in charge. But for now, Lottie was ravenous and thought of going to the kitchen herself. She ran out of her room and down the hall. She had thought to ask the maids, but wasn't sure whether they liked taking care of her or hated the mandatory arrangement. As she ran, she noticed her father. She quickly stopped and hid behind a wall. She wondered why they were here at this time, since the hall was usually empty. This time around, Lottie's mother had told her that her father wasn't the rumored monster but was a demon called Damien. He seemed like the main character of a horror story, who enjoyed bloodshed and killing others. He was also violent and made other people's lives seem insignificant. There was still a possibility that he might act like those demons in horror stories. She was grateful to have been neglected by him since he was a demon. Suddenly, the Duke got the feeling that someone was staring at him. He turned back, causing Lottie to hide behind a wall immediately. She mentally affirmed that she would try her best to avoid her father. She ran towards the kitchen where she found a maid. The maid crouched down and asked what she was doing there. Lottie told her she was hungry. The maid replied that she would give her food, so there was no need to lie. She became upset because she couldn't understand why the maid called her a liar. A voice came warning the maid not to tease her. The maid then gave Lottie some bread, telling her there wasn't anything else available. Lottie took the bread and thanked the maid politely. She sat on a chair and started eating it. Even though Lottie felt annoyed at the servant's rudeness, she had learned to be patient since her father didn't like her. She further thought of needing an adult to take care of her because she was unable to do anything if a monster emerged from under her bed. She was thankful that her father at least didn't hate or harass her. She mentally vowed to stay as quiet as her father wanted and then proceed to become independent. At least, that's what she had thought, but it didn't take that long for her idea to disappear. Lottie ran down the castle hall once again with the maid following her and asking her to slow down or she would get hurt. Lottie assured her she would be fine and continued running. She had almost encountered her father several times but never once had a conversation because he didn't pay attention to her at all. Since he didn't care about her, he allowed her to go wherever she wanted. She reached the door of her father's study, peered inside, and saw nothing strange. She was about to leave, but stopped, stepped back, and realized that the door was not closed as it usually was. She knew she couldn't let this chance slip by and discreetly entered the study. Lottie looked around and found nothing to pique her curiosity other than books. This made her sulk as she thought of exploring another room. As she was about to leave, she tripped on a book and fell to the floor, hurting herself. She looked down to see what caused her to fall and noticed a pink book. Lottie reached for the book, thinking that it would be nice of her to arrange her father's stuff as he didn't organize it properly. She then noticed that the cover of the book was blank, which shocked her. This interested her, and she started skimming through the book. She didn't know how to read, but her curiosity got the best of her. The pages were blank, leaving Lottie disappointed. She thought it was a notebook, but then she found something written on it. To her, it seemed like something her father would own. The content was also easy to read for her. It seemed like a novel to her, so she continued reading. The story shifted to the book Lottie was reading. A maid was calling for Dahlia Frodium, princess of the Frodium dukedom, and telling her that her story had become the talk of the town. She continued to tell the beautiful silver-haired princess the story about her, Dahlia Lopez, the second daughter of the Lopez family, who ended up becoming the princess of Frodium. The story sounded like a fairy tale, one that the lower class dreamed of. Dahlia was abused and scorned by the Lopez family. Taking pity on her, Duke Frodium took Dahlia in as his foster daughter, and so she grew up well. However, one day, a marquis rescued Dahlia from danger, and the two fell in love. The maid continued reporting that all the young ladies were admiring her story and were dreaming of dramatically changing their lives just like she had. Dahlia was taken aback, saying she had never been abused. The maid smiled at her and praised her kindness in protecting her former family. She called her an angel, but Dahlia sat frozen in her seat, noting that they weren't even listening to her. The maid stopped and wondered aloud about the Duke's first daughter, who would have been a perfect villainess. When Dahlia asked her about the girl, the maid revealed that not many people talked about her, so there weren't many who knew about her. Despite not being the Duke's real daughter, she was very violent. The maid further told Dahlia that she would have tormented her if she were still around. As the maid revealed the daughter's name, Lottie was stunned and brought back to reality. It was a story about a beautiful but emotionless puppet girl. She received love, learned about love, and finally fell in love. The problem was that the girl somehow became Duke Damien Frodium's foster daughter, who was Lottie's father. Even that wasn't a big deal to her, but the fact that the book stated Dahlia became the Duke's daughter when she turned 11. The story further suggested that Lottie had died last winter, diagnosed with a disease that even the doctors were unfamiliar with. Her room was locked and prohibited from being entered by others. Lottie remained shocked as she couldn't understand why she died so suddenly. She wondered whether she had died because she didn't take care of her health, but she was too young and didn't want to die. She felt upset knowing she only had 5 years left to live. When she came out of the forest for the first time, she calmed herself down and doubted whether to trust the book's content solely based on the fact that it contained her father's name. It could just be a coincidence, since her father was known throughout the kingdom as the Monster Duke. It wasn't strange to find his name in other stories like this. Lottie immediately realized that her part might be true. It hadn't been too long since she came to the mansion, and none of the servants had heard of her, and even now, they didn't speak much about her. Hence, outsiders have probably never heard of her either. The book's narrative of Lottie, the Duke's hidden daughter that only the servants knew of, could also not be a coincidence. All of a sudden, the study's door creaked open, and the book immediately burned, scaring Lottie. She swiftly turned her head back as her heart raced, wondering what kind of jerk would burn a book. It was the Duke who was looking down at her. He asked Lottie who allowed her to come into the study. Lottie became uneasy when she heard his unemotional tone. She was furious at him, unable to understand why he didn't use his words instead of burning the book, as she could have been hurt. The most unfair thing was her father, who didn't even act like one and never once cared for her. Moreover, as soon as she died, he brought back a foster daughter and treated her warmly. Lottie was sad enough to learn that she would die, but knowing that she would be compared to someone else was too much. It suddenly struck her that if she was already fated to die, did that mean that no matter what she did, she wouldn't die before then? Even if she did something that would get on her father's nerves, if that was the case, she would do whatever she wanted from then on. She stood up and confidently asked the Duke what he would have done if it were an important book. The Duke responded that he could have recognized if it was important, and besides, he wouldn't place an important book in this kind of place. Lottie wondered why he called his study this kind of place. She turned her head sideways, closed her eyes, and remarked that the burned book was a pity. She glanced at him, surprised as to why her father wasn't saying anything. As she looked at him, she found him smiling. She was even more shocked as she didn't know what to do next. She thought the Duke had gone crazy since it was the first time she had seen him smile like that. She put her hand over her mouth, wondering if he had burned his mind instead of the book. The Duke started walking towards her and found it interesting to see her live quietly all this time with that kind of personality. He asked if she was really like that. Lottie mentally answered that she was just pretending. She responded that it was her adjustment period. The Duke said that she seemed to have adjusted well now. Lottie found it hard to believe when the Duke lifted her and claimed that he needed to register her as his daughter. She was taken aback and thought that her father should have approached the situation more kindly from the beginning. The Duke summoned Veronica, who appeared out of nowhere and curtsied to him. He announced that Lottie would remain in her care as she would need a godmother since she was still young. As he gave Veronica instructions, he playfully poked Lottie's hair, irritating her and causing her to push his hand away. Veronica obediently complied with the Duke's orders and introduced herself to Lottie. Lottie instantly recognized her as the pretty lady who worked by her father's side. She thought it would be best to be close with her father's subordinates, so she smiled brightly and waved at Veronica, telling her to take care of her in the third person. The scene shifted to Lottie sitting on a bed, reflecting on how quickly they had become close in just 24 hours. Now that she had built a bond with Veronica, she decided to memorize the contents of the book in case she forgot everything. Lottie informed Veronica that she would be playing under the blanket and asked her not to disturb her. As Veronica left, Lottie threw the blanket over her head and started recalling the book's contents. The book began with Duke Frodium adopting the female lead, Dahlia. Within half a year, she was enrolled in the academy where she later met the male lead. The world, which was in chaos due to monsters, had not yet appeared. The protagonists didn't save the world or make any sacrifices, but the story ended with them falling in love with each other. Lottie wondered what had happened to her since the story began after her death. She was hardly mentioned despite being such an important character, only described as the Duke's daughter who died from a disease. The story offered no guidance on how to prevent her death or live a fulfilling life. Frustrated, Lottie clenched her fist, disappointed that the book was of no use to her. Furthermore, the demons that were supposed to be a significant part of the story had yet to appear, and Lottie knew they had vanished a long time ago. While Lottie gathered her thoughts, her stomach loudly grumbled, reminding her that she was hungry. Bashfully, she realized that she could now eat without her father, which made her more comfortable. She immediately got out of bed and contemplated eating alone in her room, just like before. The next scene showed Lottie sitting awkwardly at the dining table with the Duke. She observed him curiously, wondering why he wasn't occupied with his duties. She pouted, thinking that she should have eaten comfortably in her room instead. The Duke asked Lottie why she had come early for dinner when she was usually late. Lottie explained that she was hungry and questioned why her father was present since he normally worked at this time. The Duke replied that he wanted to eat with her and smiled softly, noting that she must have been really hungry. Lottie chewed on her fingers and asked when the meal would be served. The Duke informed her that the kitchen was slower that day, although Lottie mentally disagreed as they had simply arrived early. He then asked her what she had been doing recently. Lottie shared that she had been exploring the mansion and playing with Veronica. She added that she ate with her father and played with the maids. Their conversation was interrupted when the food arrived. Lottie attempted to cut her food into pieces but struggled. This frustrated her, and she couldn't eat it with her hands as she used to in her room. The Duke noticed her difficulty, and Lottie believed it was the knife's fault. Suddenly, her knife slipped from her hands and hit her father's right cheek, causing it to bleed. Lottie panicked, knowing she was in deep trouble. People claimed that the Duke's true identity was that of a demon, and even if you stabbed him with a knife, he wouldn't shed a tear. Lottie thought that he must have been hurt by it. She tried to reach him quickly, but the chair began to fall. Being too high for her, Lottie prepared herself to hit the floor as she closed her eyes. However, when she realized she hadn't fallen, she opened her eyes and found herself in the Duke's arms. He looked at her worriedly and asked if she was okay. Lottie returned the worried look and assured him that she was fine. The Duke then told her to be careful next time. Lottie apologized to her father for hurting him, and the Duke stared at her intently. Lottie thought to herself that he was angry. However, her father expressed his concern for her safety, which touched Lottie. She realized that the Duke didn't hate her, but she couldn't understand why he had looked at her so coldly before. Lottie reached for her father's face, recalling how her mother used to take care of her when she was sick. She tried to use her magic to make her father's pain go away, but he remained silent. Lottie asked if her magic hadn't worked, and the Duke smiled and said that the pain was gone. Lottie wondered if she was as talented as a wizard. The Duke sighed in relief and asked if it meant that she didn't hate him. Lottie was surprised by his words and asked if he thought she hated him. She realized that both she and her father had misunderstood each other. Lottie reflected on how people in the mansion were afraid of her father, which resulted in her arrival also being misunderstood. The Duke placed her back in her seat and confessed that he was glad she didn't hate him. They continued eating, and Lottie thanked him. The Duke commented on her good appetite and asked where she got it from. Lottie cheekily asked if he would get mad if she didn't eat at her age, to which the Duke replied with the same question. Lottie stared at him, and the scene shifted to her interrogating two maids. She believed that, despite her high ranking, they must have felt some relevance while taking care of her and might have taken pity on her. She questioned them fearlessly, and the maids whispered amongst themselves about what to do. One maid reassured the other, saying that Lottie was just a child, but the other pointed out that Miss Veronica was present as well. The first maid mentioned that Miss Veronica would likely take their side over a random child who suddenly appeared. The maid then smiled at Lottie and said that they didn't talk about anything concerning her. Lottie looked at them coldly and stated that they were talking about her. She ordered them to act as they had before, regardless of her connection to the Duke, as she had been acknowledged by the estate's owner. Lottie questioned their sudden silence and asked if they were looking down upon the Frodium name. The maid flinched and apologized nervously to Lottie. Lottie studied the maid and reflected on how the maid's fear mirrored her own when she was in front of the Duke. The maid was mentally debating what had caused such a sudden change in the girl who couldn't even utter a sound when ignored. Lottie turned around to leave, stating that her father was waiting for her. The scene shifted to the Duke waiting for Lottie, and when he saw her, he remarked that she was late. Lottie bit her inner cheek and promised that it wouldn't happen again. She was angry, but she knew she couldn't take it out on him. On the other hand, the Duke noticed that she was wearing the same clothes she had worn many times before. He told her that the coachman was waiting for them, so they had to hurry. As they were about to leave, Lottie noticed Veronica waving at her cheerfully, wishing her a safe trip. Lottie asked the Duke if Veronica was not coming, to which he replied that it would just be the two of them for today since Veronica had something else to do. Lottie waved goodbye to Veronica from her father's arms and contemplated asking her to join them next time. They sat in the carriage and set off. Lottie looked out of the window in amazement, as it was her first time riding in a carriage. In the past, she hadn't thought that she could even get out of the forest, but now she confessed to herself that she liked sightseeing. She wanted to know more about this world. She stared at her father, who was sitting opposite her. The Duke was lost in his thoughts. Lottie thought that even though they had grown closer, her father was always busy. Other than when they ate, she hadn't been alone with him. He suddenly asked her if she was doing well. Lottie pouted unhappily and said that if he was so curious, he should come to visit her. Lottie realized that the maids were probably bad-mouthing her because her father was not taking good care of her. The Duke told her that he would reconsider it, along with what had happened earlier. Another reason why she couldn't consider him her father was because her mother had said so. Lottie's eyes widened suddenly as she thought of her father. She had been curious from the beginning why he had placed her on the estate. If he acted like she didn't exist, there was no way her mother would lie. But why would he do that to her? Lost in her thoughts, Lottie accidentally asked aloud whether he thought of her as his daughter. She immediately realized what she had said and clasped her hands around her mouth. She thought that she should have been happy with the fact that he had at least accepted her. The Duke calmly asked Lottie whether she thought she wasn't his daughter. At that moment, they arrived at their destination, which was a massive house. The Duke walked out of the carriage with Lottie in his arms, and immediately a man rushed towards them. The man greeted them, complimenting Lottie as an adorable baby, and asked the Duke whether he had come looking for the baby's clothes. Lottie stared at her father, holding his collar tightly, and mentally asked him to scold the man for calling her a baby. The man further added that he would prepare several clothes to see which ones would fit his baby best. Lottie grasped her father's collar tighter as the Duke replied that he should prioritize comfort over style. The man assured him that special magic was placed in the clothes to ensure comfort. The man showed them the clothes and asked them to try them on. As Lottie tried on the different clothes, the man complimented her in every dress. He confessed that everyone said the clothes were magic wings, but after today, the one wearing the clothes was the angel.